Hey guys, today I want to talk about a topic that I think a lot of you are excited for, and that, of course, is capital ships. Star Citizen is one of the coolest in game experiences because of its ability to make you feel like you're in the game. Whether you're observing tracers being fired in a ship battle above you, or running through a carrick to reach the turrets because you're being attacked by pirates, Star Citizen delivers an experience unlike anything you've ever played before. A big part of this experience is the ability to move around ship interiors while in flight and interact with the environment inside. Star Citizen is one of the only games that you can have a firefight inside a ship that's currently being flown by another player. This experience is heightened when you add massive 150-meter plus ships with huge interiors into the equation. The only real capital ship we can currently pilot in the game is the Origin 890 Jump, and that ship is missing much of its functionality along with its main gameplay loop it's supposed to support. In this video, I want to talk about the future of capital ships with an emphasis on combat and how they should function in the Star Citizen universe. First of all, I'd like to cover how CIG and Chris Roberts have stated that they want capital ships to feel overall in Star Citizen, so that we have an initial goal or standard that we want to achieve. Individual stats and gameplay functions can change over time, so I think that looking at a broader goal can help us predict how CIG will implement these functions and where they'll eventually settle. Chris has stated that he wants Star Citizen to feel like World War II in space, alluding to a universe that feels much like contemporary science fiction franchises like Star Wars, Star Trek, and Halo. In these universes, fighters and bombers fly much like modern-day aircraft, while capital ships function as large flying warships akin to the naval vessels during World War II. These large ships are characterized by their slow speed and heavy firepower. Whether it's the frigates of the Halo series, firing their massive MAC cannons at invading Covenant warships, or Star Destroyers using their sheer size and weaponry to outmatch the Rebel scum, capital ships tend to be a focal point of any space combat. In Star Citizen, the capital ships should be the slowest but most survivable ships in game, being able to take a lot of damage before becoming ineffective or destroyed. The difficulty alone of gathering a bunch of players onto one ship for a period long enough to experience good gameplay loops can be difficult, and this should be rewarded with increased capabilities unable to be achieved with smaller ships. If capital ships can be destroyed too easily, many players will find the time and cost too great and abandon these large ships for smaller fighters or medium-sized multi-crew ships. This, in my opinion, would hurt Star Citizen since the scale and complexity of these large ships can't be found in other games, whereas there are many games where you can pilot a starfighter through different universes. Small, medium, and sub-capital class ships should still be a viable and fun option to pilot around the verse, but the larger and more costly a ship and its crew become, the more benefits these individuals should receive. Capital ships should not be the most common size of ship encountered in the verse, but should be a focal point of almost any fleet, making them a regular sight in Star Citizen. The next aspect of capital ships, and one of the most striking, are weapons. An obvious aspect of this is that capital ships will have access to the largest weapons in game, but given their large size, most of these ships will carry a variety of weapon sizes that fill various purposes. To simplify these weapons, we'll break them into groups. Much like weapons on the large naval ships of World War II, these groups will be primaries, secondaries, point defense, and torpedoes. Primaries, like the name suggests, are one of, if not the primary form of offensive damage for a capital ship. These weapons will most likely be the largest sized and are optimized for engaging other capital and some sub-capital ships. They will also most likely have a massive increase in range over smaller weapons, being able to engage from tens of kilometers out. A general rule of thumb would be that primary weapons need to be size 8 or above in order to reach the ranges required of capital ship combat. The next group of weapons we'll talk about will be secondaries. These are medium-sized weapons on capital ships that are still focused on targeting other capital or sub-capital ships, but at a much lower range. They will generally fall in the size 5 to 7 range and are meant to increase the DPS of a capital ship when in close combat. Secondaries are probably the main difference between capital ship weapon loadouts and smaller ship weapon loadouts, as most sub-capital and smaller ships focus mainly on a singular weapon group that has similar ranges, followed by point defense on some ships. It is expected that some capital ships could focus on a secondary weapon-heavy loadout if their role requires it, but this will most likely come at a cost of less DPS for your primaries. The third weapon group we will talk about is point defense. This is a group focused on defending a capital ship against smaller, faster-moving targets such as fighters, bombers, and incoming missile ordnance. These can include both guns and missiles size 4 and under, with the guns being able to target ships and incoming torpedoes, while missiles will mostly be used to target other small ships. All capital ships will need an adequate amount of point defense, as small torpedo bombers represent a very cost-effective way to damage or destroy larger vessels and are expected to be a common sight in the verse. The last weapon group we will look at will be torpedoes. Torpedoes can function as the primary weapon for many capital ships, or offer a second option for doing damage at longer distances. These weapons do excessive amount of damage but have a very limited ammo count, and can be shot down by point defense. Many of the capital ships that use torpedoes as their main form of damage are geared towards hunting ships that are much larger than themselves. To go along with primaries and torpedoes, one aspect of the game that will need to be updated and expanded for these large weapons to work as intended is scanning. All ships in game can currently scan and target other ships, but in the future, some ships should be able to scan for and target ships while also relaying that information to a capital ship that is farther away so it can engage from a longer distance. This will encourage ships to work together to take down dangerous targets, as a well-trained fleet can disable dangerous systems and weapons on an enemy ship before it has the chance to return fire. Overall, weapons on capital ships are a relatively straightforward topic, and CIG seems to be going this route with the gameplay. But it is important to keep track of these ideas, as forgetting how capital ships' weapons should function could have detrimental effects on the meta and gameplay as a whole. Another vital aspect of capital ships is their armor. In the 3.18 update, we are finally getting ship hull resistances to ballistic weapons, which is a good start, but we have quite a ways to go. Chris and CIG have stated that they want a very in-depth damage model that will take a ton of factors into account. And so rather than try to break down the exact complex calculations and values that system will need, we can look at how capital ships' armor will affect the feel and role of these ships to get a close approximation. Like we've stated previously, capital ships should be the slowest and least maneuverable ships in the game due to their large size. This in itself can be a negative, as it makes them an easy target for smaller, faster ships, but even adding large health pools can be an insufficient way to create durability if the smaller ships can just bully the larger ones for long periods of time with basically no recourse. This is where armor comes in. Current large ships can struggle to catch fighters, and even vessels like the Hammerhead, a subcapital designed to kill fighters, can fail to match even mediocre light fighter pilots in some instances. If, for example, the Hammerhead had armor that severely limited the ability for size 3 and under gun type weapons to damage it, this would make fighters at least have to change their strategy when taking out this ship. Massive capital ships in the future will need this, as while the Hammerhead can't outmaneuver fighters already, capital ships will struggle to keep even the slowest fighters off their weakest points. Armor also allows for another way to differentiate capital ship roles, as some capital ships will focus on being the slowest possible, unkillable behemoths, while others will trade much of that armor for relatively good maneuverability. They will still be large capital ships after all. Overall, I think most size 4 and under weapons should struggle to damage even the weakest points on capital ships, with some areas of more durable capitals being unable to be damaged by even larger weapons. This will require smaller craft to use missiles and torpedoes to damage capitals, limiting them to a smaller ammunition loadout, which will therefore balance these ships against the larger craft. As we've stated previously, capital ships need to be slow. In most popular media that Star Citizen attempts to replicate, capital ships move at a snail's pace when compared to smaller fighters. While some universes like Star Wars give top speed numbers for large ships in the thousands of kilometers per hour, when you watch the video content or play the games, these large ships are almost stationary when compared to the speed of starfighters. It's not impossible to make a game where your capital ships can move and maneuver at high speeds while still making it fun, but combat either tends to be relatively unintuitive, or the benefits of these larger ships are so great that starfighters are next to useless. Both of these are outcomes that Star Citizen really wishes to avoid. CIG has shown off master modes in the past, which are flight modes that separate travel and combat modes in order to bring the operational speeds of your vessel down, while still letting players traverse the universe in a reasonable amount of time. Travel speeds for capital ships can be expected to be similar to other ships' top speeds, but when dropping into SCM, or standard control mode, these speeds will drop dramatically. The Origin 890 Jump Super Yacht is the only capital ship currently in game and has an SCM speed of 80 meters per second, and this comes with less armor than capital ships actually designed for combat. In my opinion, most capital ships will fall between 40 and 80 meters per second in SCM, with the higher numbers being for smaller corvettes and ships that are specifically designed for speed. These are still very slow when compared to most fighters that are topping out between 200 and 300 meters per second in SCM. These slow speeds may be off-putting for some players, but in order to make the ships feel and function as intended, anything higher may be detrimental to the gameplay experience. Now on to a relatively divisive topic in the Star Citizen community, crew requirements and NPCs. Currently, multi-crew ships in Star Citizen don't have all the functionality that CIG wishes to implement. Positions like engineer will be a full-time position for large ships when power management comes into effect, and many large weapon systems require a separate person to fire even if they're mounted to the spine of a ship rather than a turret. I don't doubt that these positions will be better if manned by a player, but NPC or non-player characters will basically be mandatory to run on almost all capital ships. The Idris M, for example, has an old minimum crew number of 8 with a maximum of 28. If these numbers are to be believed, you'll need at least 8 people just to fly the ship, let alone man all the weapon systems and auxiliary positions. Now, I want to restate that multi-crewing should be heavily encouraged and remain a large part of Star Citizen. But if you require a large group to just pilot a capital ship, you're cutting off a massive section of what should be endgame content to what is probably a majority of the audience that will struggle to gather in the required numbers. I can speak from experience that getting 7 people together to fully crew a hammerhead can be a time-consuming task, and the individual turret gunner experience can be very mediocre during much of the time spent in that role. I personally have had a ton of fun being a turret gunner in a Scorpius or a Redeemer, where 1 or 2 turrets are the main focus of combat, and the pilot still has a lot of skillful gameplay at their fingertips. But many ships, especially large ones with many different turrets and weapon systems, can struggle to find meaningful gameplay for the players inside for a majority of the time actually playing the game. No one wants to sit in a tiny turret in the rear of a capital ship when the vehicle is engaging the enemy with its main guns at a range of 10 kilometers plus. This isn't even taking into account that some players may only have an hour to play per day if they have real life obligations to a job, family, or friends that really should take precedence over Star Citizen. It's easy to lose track of the average player experience if you play this game constantly, but the verse should be a fun place to inhabit for everyone, not just the people who sink thousands of hours into the game. It's for this reason I think capital ships should be limited by their expense and time commitment, but not crew requirement, as some people may only want or be able to play with 1 or 2 friends at most. In my opinion, it should be possible, with enough time put into the game, to crew some of the smaller ships with just yourself and NPCs you hire. I know that many people will think this will make multi-crew less important, and to a certain extent it will, but some players like myself want to experience capital ships in Star Citizen for much of our gameplay. And cutting off this large section of content or limiting it to a smaller, more dedicated section of the audience can only be detrimental to the life of the game. Multi-crew ships in Star Citizen should be accessible to all players, but with limited effectiveness based on percentage of player to NPC crew. For my last few points, I'd like to talk about the overall positives and negatives of capital ships in Star Citizen if they're implemented like I've stated in previous sections, and bring up some aspects of their gameplay you may not have thought about. First, let's go over some positives. Like I've previously stated, capital ships will be big, slow, and powerful. This means that adding these larger ships will provide spaceship combat gameplay to individuals who may not thrive in the high-speed environments of dogfights, but could perform well in a more strategy-centered role. The mindset of a capital ship pilot or captain should be more methodical, whereas fighter pilots may rely more on instinctive training. Having these different gameplay styles working together in a seamless environment will allow all sorts of players to interact with each other at the same time while also enjoying the experience. Another benefit of capital ships will be that if an individual player is able to acquire one, they can use this ship to benefit a larger fleet. We know that in future updates, solar systems like Pyro will be much larger and harder to explore for many smaller ships in the game, but with capital ships you may be able to refuel, rearm, or store your valuable finds, so you can keep enjoying the gameplay you like without having to spend as much time traveling. Personally, I'm really looking forward to escorting large hauling fleets with a few capital ships and supporting elements. This gameplay looks really interesting, and CIG could make it fun by giving pirates or NPCs a lot of incentive to try attacking these large convoys. Now for some negatives. While I really want capital ship gameplay to be a large part of my in-game experience, no gameplay should be implemented without at least some hurdles to overcome. Firstly, and probably the largest negative to capital ships, will be their cost. Capital ships should come with a pretty excessive upfront cost that will incentivize players to do some research before buying one to make sure that they're getting a good purchase for the gameplay they're trying to accomplish. These ships should represent endgame content in an MMO, which means that they should take quite a bit of time to save up for by any player. Once purchased, capital ships will also have expensive upkeep costs. Refueling, repairing, rearming, and especially upgrading should cost way more than smaller ships and scale with class and power. This means it won't be impossible to make money while in a capital ship, but you'll have to choose when and where to use them. This brings me to my second negative to capital ships, which is the locations you can actually use them. Capital ships have a few features that will make them better in certain locations and areas and terrible in others. For one, capital ships will struggle to fly in atmosphere, and even when they can, the hydrogen fuel cost will make this a very expensive endeavor. Capital ships will want to stay in orbit and send down smaller craft to planets if entering the atmosphere is required for a mission. Along with this, some areas of space will be harder to reach for capital ships due to jump points only allowing certain sizes of ships through, or asteroid fields making traversing them with a capital ship too dangerous. The size of these ships will also make spotting them much easier, so traversing enemy-held territory may be an option in a more stealthy ship, but too much of a risk in a capital. The last negative is more of a feature that will make capital ships less abundant in some areas and more abundant in others. This aspect of the game I'm talking about will be war-torn areas. It's no secret that the Star Citizen universe has its fair share of species and factions that are hostile to the UEE and humans as a whole. Squadron 42, Star Citizen's single-player counterpart, will be centered around the war with the Vanduul a few years prior to our in-game experience in Star Citizen. As far as we know, this war is still going on in the current Star Citizen universe, making the Vanduul a likely enemy of the player if they choose to inhabit UEE space close to enemy territory. This will likely give players the opportunity to hunt down enemy Vanduul capital ships or invading fleets, and destroy them for payment from the UEE along with spoils from any destroyed ships. These missions could pay a hefty sum and make using a combat-focused capital ship very profitable, but also very risky due to the Vanduul often using larger and more dangerous capital ships than the player can even realistically get their hands on. This will make capital ship owners frequent this part of the verse over others, which can give players who don't want to fight these larger ships as often other areas that they can thrive in. This type of area can also work for UEE separatist factions or other hostile alien species, as the Xi'an's diplomatic relations with the UEE are tenuous at the best of times. So let's quickly go over some bullet points to sum up my views on how capital ships should function. First, in my opinion, capital ships should be given enough negatives to make them an option for endgame play, but not an auto pick for all content. Second, NPCs should be able to make up for most of the recruit requirements, but have negatives that make players the more attractive option if you can include them in your crew. And lastly, the powerful weapons and thick armor of combat-focused capital ships should be balanced with a very slow speed and excessive cost. In my opinion, most of, if not all of these changes are required in order to make capital ships function as intended. Hopefully this video brought up some ideas or aspects of capital ships you hadn't thought about, or gave you some idea how you'd like capital ships to function in the game. I'd like to state that these are a lot of my opinions with a little bit of historical backing from what CIG has said in the past. It's important to take everyone's feedback so that we can make Star Citizen the best experience possible for everyone involved. I'm extremely passionate about this game and really want to see it and its capital ships succeed. If you agree or disagree with any of the points I made in this video, please put constructive responses in the comments below, as well as any video editing tips, as I'm really new to this sort of thing. Also, please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, as I have more similar content about Star Citizen planned. Let me know if there are any specific topics you want me to cover, as I'm planning on covering capital ship classes and specific ship breakdowns next. This was meant to be more of a quick and dirty overview of capital ships, so if there's a topic you'd like expanded upon, let me know as I can talk about it in a future video and hopefully go a bit more in depth. Until then, I hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you next time.